Hello, and welcome to Stowe Talks, a podcast designed to support people going through a relationship breakdown and all the challenges this brings. I'm Matthew Taylor.
And I'm Lisa Gatchell, family lawyers at Stowe Family Law, and today we are joined by Emma Pickering, Senior Operations Manager at Refuge, on understanding tech abuse. What is it, how to spot it, and can you stop it? Hi Emma, thank you for joining us today. Do you want to kick us off with just a bit of background about you, how you started to work in this area?
Yeah, sure. So I oversee the Technology Facilitated Abuse and Economic Empowerment team. Appreciate that's a mouthful. So the team was established in 2017 through Refuge. We are the UK's largest single provider of domestic abuse services in the UK for women and children. And we were established because there was a growing trend on our recording system that technology was being misused to harass, stalk and abuse victims. So my team was established. We were funded initially by Google, and we started off as quite a small team, and the purpose was to educate and raise awareness internally with our frontline staff to help ensure that when survivors reach out for support through our frontline services, they receive support in relation to technology facilitated abuse. So we support them with tech assessments to identify technology that's being misused against them and make sure that they're empowered to stay online safely and use those devices safely. Because what we noticed was other agencies were quite often saying to survivors, the safest thing for you to do is remove yourself offline, change your phone number, make significant changes to keep themselves safe. And we wanted to move away from that. So our key messages really have always been to empower people to use technology safely. And then from that, we've grown really, and we're a slightly larger team now of 11 of us, including myself. And within my team, we have economic leads that focus on online economic abuse. So when debts, coerced debt, fraud has been taken out in a victim's name by a perpetrator. We have a youth tech lead as well that focuses on raising awareness of online grooming abuse in the context of intimate partner relationships, and raising awareness as well through parent workshops. And we also have a national tech abuse lead that works alongside our national domestic abuse helpline. So ensuring that any survivor across the country, when they contact Refuge through the national domestic abuse helpline, receives support in regards to technology facilitated abuse.
So, it sounds just from that sort of brief description that it's really quite a wide area and in quite a short space of time, if you're saying 2017 since the team's established. That might make this, what I thought was going to be a very simple question to start with, maybe a bit harder. But just for anyone who's not really familiar with the phrase tech abuse, what is tech abuse? What does it involve?
So we always use the term technology facilitated abuse. And it is, in its most simplest terms, it's the misuse of any form of technology to harass, stalk and abuse a survivor. And that can be from your everyday devices that we all need to use, such as our phones, features within phones that can locate, stalk, harass a victim, constant calls, messages, using home devices as well to isolate survivors, such as the Ring doorbell. It ensures that a survivor then cannot leave the home without being monitored or have visitors come into the home without being monitored. Google Home Hubs, Alexas also can drop in, listen, transcribe as well information. So it just isolates the survivor into staying within that home, really, and not being able to reach out for support to agencies or family and friends. And what we noticed during COVID was this was really heightened as well. And the misuse of stalkerware. So that's a software that's placed on a survivor's device without their consent and knowledge most of the time, if not all the time. And what happens then is it allows that perpetrator to monitor every interaction on that device. And again, that isolates and creates barriers. So when agencies are saying, why doesn't she just reach out for support or leave the relationship? It becomes really difficult to make safe contact with anybody because it adds additional barriers.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, Matt, but I'm finding that it's becoming more and more of an issue in some of my cases. So recent examples are somebody using the Alexa device to turn on particular unpleasant songs every time somebody walks into the room. I think it was anything basically with devil in the title. Whenever my client walked into the room, the song would start playing. And another one being an Apple tag that was placed into a handbag and hidden in the handbag so that, they knew exactly where they were going all the time. And, you wouldn't even know it was there.
Yeah, I think that's right. It comes up in increasing amounts. Those are both that sort of thing I've had before. Ring doorbell is something that comes up a lot on interior security systems, and that allows a perpetrator to say, "I saw that you were X, Y, and Z," when someone thinks, well, they're having a private conversation. Given that a lot of these things are, like Lisa said, it can be the tag in the lining of a handbag or something like that. How do people discover that they've been victims of technology facilitated abuse?
I think quite often when survivors reach out to us, they have reached out to other agencies sometimes as well, and they've been disbelieved because a lot of what they're describing can sound either sometimes really trivial in some of the instances. So if they're describing, well, my perpetrator is putting a different song on that has a particular meaning every time I enter a room, somebody could brush that off and just say, well, it's coincidental. He's not doing it on purpose. He hasn't got access to the device. He doesn't live with you anymore. And also, as well, sometimes some of the instances what a survivor describes seems really far-fetched to a lot of other agencies. But through our research, what we've identified is it's all very plausible, possible. So it's really important to believe a survivor, and they should really trust their gut instinct. And when they come to us as well, when we do an assessment, we try and unpick, well, what's been happening to make you think that there is a reason for concern, and also try and describe as well and identify if there's key aspects that we need to be concerned about. So quite often the survivor may say to us, he knows where I'm going at particular points of time. He can relay particular conversations. And then we'll try and unpick, is that in the home? Is it in particular rooms? Is it through messaging platforms? Is it through phone calls? Is it only to particular people, or is it to everybody? And then by doing that assessment, we can try and unpick where the issue really is. And quite often what we find as well is it isn't just one form of technology that's being misused. There's multiple devices and accounts and apps that are probably being misused against the survivor.
It's really frightening, actually, isn't it? That, we live in an age where people can sort of drop in using our, home hub or Alexa that's on the side and listen into our conversations. I mean, if that becomes apparent that that's happening, what's the first thing that you can do to protect yourself?
The first thing that's really important is to not make any significant changes, because you can alert your perpetrator that you're aware that you're being monitored or tracked, and actually making any big changes could actually really increase your risk. And it's important that you reach out for support and advice. But if you're concerned that the devices and accounts that you're using are compromised, try and buy a burner phone or try and use a safe phone to make contact with an agency such as Refuge. Contacting the National Domestic Abuse Helpline is important. If you're going to be searching online for things like, is my partner tracking, monitoring me, be mindful that your internet history is probably being monitored. So again, use a safe device. And we have a tech safety website as well at Refuge, where if you land on that website, it gives you advice and talks you through practical information of how to secure your tech. But the first thing to do is, we can't give this generic advice to everybody because everybody's situation is different. If a survivor was looking at fleeing immediately, then the advice that we would give her is completely different to a survivor that's looking at staying in a relationship for the next 6 months and is planning on leaving and putting a plan together. So the advice would look completely different. So that tailored advice is really important. So contacting the National Domestic Abuse Helpline so you can receive tailored advice is really important.
Do you find that technology facilitated abuse goes hand in hand with other forms of domestic abuse, or does it tend to be a standalone, or does it just vary completely from case to case?
No, it's always with other forms of abuse. So it's a form of coercive control to monitor, stalk, harass somebody, and it's a very powerful tool to coercively control somebody. But what we often find is it goes in line with physical abuse, stalking, monitoring, coercive control, emotional abuse as well, but also sexual abuse, because we see a real risk and increase of threats to sharing intimate images being circulated online. Hidden cameras as well to record, to blackmail survivors into sharing further intimate images, money, resuming a relationship, not to leave a relationship. So sexual abuse as well, and financial abuse, economic abuse also goes hand in hand. The two entwine very closely, because what we're seeing is it's incredibly difficult to perpetrate economic abuse without there being some form of online method. So taking out credit cards, loans in another person's name most probably will be online now.
And in terms of intimate image abuse, is something that you mentioned there. fairly recently, it's been a couple of relatively high-profile cases: Stephen Bear and Georgia Harrison in the criminal arena, and there's recently been the first kind of civil case where a lady. Confidential information in terms of it remains anonymous, but received civil damages for her partner covertly filming her and sharing those intimate images. It's obviously an area which there's sort of growing awareness, and it strikes me that the legal systems are only really beginning to grasp those issues. So, could you talk a little bit around the prevalence of those issues and how you can deal with those when you've got this hugely coercive threat often, which is, I will disclose these images if you don't do what I say?
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely damaging. And what research actually does show us is a real direct line between threats to share intimate images and images being circulated online and people actually taking their own lives. And that's not spoken about nearly enough. And I think also there's still real victim blaming. So when unfortunately people do report to the police and to agencies, there's a real risk of them receiving a really unhelpful response and saying to them, well, why did you send these images? They're out in the public domain now. It's impossible for us to try and retrieve the images. And again, putting that responsibility back on the survivor. But it's important to note, one, everyone is entitled to send an intimate image if they choose to do so. It's then the perpetrator's responsibility to not then go on and circulate and share. So they should be held accountable. But also we're seeing an increase in survivors that haven't ever sent any images as well to a perpetrator. They don't know if they're even in existence. The use of deepfake technology is increasingly being misused, where the image doesn't even exist of the survivor, but what he's used is the intimate image of another person and superimposed her image onto that video, and then is circulating that. And that's increasingly, we're seeing that in South Asian communities as well. So then there's a real risk not only from that individual perpetrator, but also the wider community. So then she's completely isolated from her family and networks, and she's completely shamed. So it is a real risk, and we are unfortunately seeing a real increase in reports of not only threats to share, but intimate images being circulated. Hence why the online safety bill is so important, regulating social media platforms so they take responsibility and they take action quickly, remove the content online. They're responsive to violence against women and girls, and when someone's being harassed and abused online.
And when we look at things like stalker software, so AirTags and the software that can be downloaded on phones, is there anything that people can do to be able to see if there is something that's there?
So the AirTags are completely separate to the stalkerware. So in terms of stalkerware, there will be signs that that's potentially on your device. So things such as battery drainage, excessive battery drainage, your phone will be excessively hot to touch, and your data will be used twice as much as what you would be using because your phone is syncing to another device as well and mirroring. But things such as emails being read and then popping back up again, or things being looked at without you checking them first, messages being read, and maybe glitches in conversations that you're having with somebody on the phone. Because that person will be able to see your banking history, they'll be able to go into all your apps, your camera roll. So if someone's having access and threatening you, for instance, with particular images that you haven't shared with anyone, and they're saying and can describe that image to you, there's a chance that potentially that they have access to your camera roll. That doesn't just mean it could be stalkerware. There could be synced Apple IDs as well that could allow that feature. But with stalkerware, it would give there would be particular signs that would indicate that there is potential stalkerware on the device.
Can they download this device without having access to it, or do they have to have access to the phone to be able to download it?
Some do, and there are some that are on the market currently, and I won't name them because then that's advertising them. But some also, yeah, there is an option for some, but you have to pay for those as well, and they're quite an expensive monthly fee, where you can potentially put some on via other methods.
And are these apps that are just available through app stores and things? And if so, what you sort of alluded to it earlier about the responsibility that the social media companies have in terms of intimate image abuse, but do the platform providers not have a responsibility to prevent this software being used, and what can be done, whether through the online safety bill or what have you, to kind of prevent people from being able to access these apps, because it's hard to see a sort of justifiable reason for them.
No, you're right. There is no justifiable reason to need an app on someone's device that you cannot see. You don't know it exists. It's really difficult to try and find any evidence that it's there, but it allows a person to have complete access to your device. So Google did some work where they removed all of the stalkerware apps from the App Store. But what's then gone on to happen is they're then put in the App Store and the Play Store via parental monitoring apps, which there is a massive market for and people do demand. So somebody will actively want to download an app to monitor their child's location, for instance, to make sure they're maybe getting to school safely. But within those apps, there are particular features that are stalkerware, such as being able to listen into the device, read messages, listen into calls, search history, and things like that, really. So stalkerware is now being integrated into parental monitoring apps, so they're able to then put them on the market that way. And I think there's this normalization around monitoring of children and other people and relationships that we need to have conversations about, that it's not normal to monitor somebody in that way, but we're normalizing it in society, so it's allowing them perpetrators to download these apps and use them in the way that they are.
Do you find that there's any? I'm just interested about the age profiles and demographic of survivors, because I've read things online about, particularly teenage girls, probably a little bit stereotypically, but living on their phones and becoming adjusted to a world where it is a lot more prevalent to send intimate images because there's a facility to do that certainly didn't exist when I was that age. Is it something that there's a particular age demographic for victims and survivors?
No, definitely not. I mean, children are just as much a victim of technology facilitated abuse and domestic abuse as adults are. And we are unfortunately seeing very small children being handed technology, GPS trackers, smartwatches, phones, through child contact as well. And family courts actually insisting on handing over these devices for safety reasons. And then what they're doing is facilitating this form of abuse, and it's allowing a perpetrator to track and monitor a victim and the child. So children themselves are also a victim. But obviously there is concerns that children and teenagers especially are using technology more than any other age group. But I wouldn't say that they're potentially more at risk. I would say that anybody is potentially at risk from technology facilitated abuse.
I was just going to say that it was all when you were talking a minute ago about being led by fear almost, and speaking about it from a sort of a parental perspective. I've got a 10-year-old. He has just had a mobile phone, and he wants to start going out on his own a little bit more. And to me, it gives great reassurance knowing that I can just check where he is and that he is where he's meant to be. And, going back to what Matt just said, I mean, that wouldn't have been available to my parents when I was younger. It was very much you have to be back by this time, or when the lights are coming on, the street lights are coming on, that's the time that you need to be coming home. But the question there is, I suppose, are we then, because it is deemed normal and reasonable to do it in those circumstances, are we then normalizing it to the extent that our children will be so used to it having been almost, I hate to use the word tracked, but almost having been tracked when they were younger, that, is this then just going to increase in prevalence as they grow up?
Yeah, and that's definitely the concern that we have as well, that as you've just mentioned, if we are normalising these apps for children and then they go on to have intimate partner relationships in their teen years, they're going to be normalising using them, sharing location, sharing history, sharing passwords, sharing too much of their private information with another person, and not always feeling like I don't have the option of saying no here, which is key and what's important. And then that seeps then into adult relationships as well. And it just allows that opportunity for somebody to misuse that and to abuse that situation and misuse that form of technology. I appreciate, as a parent myself, the want and the need to kind of make sure that children are safe online. But I think the key things as parents that we can do there is make sure that we're informed of what they're using as well, because so many times children and young people will be on particular apps and we as parents probably don't have any idea of how the app works, the particular settings and features, the ways in which we can apply parental controls within that app to stop somebody, say, talking to somebody on another platform. And children are incredibly savvy. They know the way around apps and that they can turn off those features, and then before you know it, they're back online and potentially talking to a stranger. So what we do in the workshops with both children and parents is do them alongside one another to make sure we're talking to the children about using the app safely, and also the parents about educating them on how the app works and the features within them as well. Because it's not always ideal to say you just don't use it, because that's not going to be helpful as well. Some children want to be on particular apps, so it's about using them safely.
I was going to say, are those courses that you provide to everybody? Is anybody available? Because I'm sure there's lots of people listening to this that would actually say, actually, that's really interesting. You know, as my children get older, I think, you know, I don't know what's going on with the apps that they're downloading, etc. So, you know, is that something that's available to everybody, or is that something that you do specifically in relation to the work with survivors?
We can look at definitely developing workshops to wider audiences. We don't just do it for survivors. We will, and we have developed workshops in the community for parents as well. And it's not a blame thing as well. It's really difficult to keep on top of all the different forms of apps, technology, developments. That is a full-time job in itself. So this isn't, you know, looking at parents and holding them more to account. It's about making sure that we're helping inform them and educate them around, this is what the app looks like, and these are the concerns, these are the hidden features, and these are how we can put set parental controls that a child cannot override.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult for parents to be across everything. I mean, my two are only little; they're 6 and 8, and I struggle with the apps that they play, the games on the iPad, on our walled iPad, that they don't, you know, have access to the internet on unless my thumbprint goes on it. But it must be really difficult to keep up with that. But I guess the education is about not just recognizing apps and knowing the sort of technical knowledge, but strikes me as there's a lot about consent, particularly when you're talking about, you know, maybe teenagers and sharing of information and feeling that they have to what extent can that feed into, you know, school educating about consent, whether it's sexual consent, whether it's consent to give your data and give images of yourself? Is that something that is being looked at enough, do you think?
Yeah, I do think there are certain agencies that are doing great work within schools, raising awareness of online grooming, sharing of intimate images safely if you choose to do so, how you can have safe contact with other people online. But I do think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of schools being more skilled and having safe conversations with young people. And also there's this tendency as well to say to a young person, just come offline, give me your phone, when we know that that actually isn't going to be helpful. It's really impossible to try and get a phone off a young person as well, especially when they've got like different accounts that they're using every day, and, you know, insisting and logging in and chatting with their friends. So it's just, again, goes back to the education piece around, this is what they are using online. Immerse yourself in their world a little bit and see what's happening, and then you can educate yourself around how that they can remain there safely.
So you have a tool on your website, the tech assessment tool. Can you talk us through that and how that works?
We have two. So we have the home tech safety tool. That is a virtual tool. So it's a house and you navigate yourself through the house. And that was designed based off an increase in survivors reporting to us home devices being misused against them. So we've got a Ring doorbell, a smartwatch, a Google Home Hub, smart TV, etc. within the home. And when you hover over those appliances, what happens is a guide will pop up and it talks you through visually how you can secure those devices within your home. And we also have the digital breakup tool as well. So that's a tablet, and then within that you hover over the particular apps. And again, through those apps, it has a visual guide to talk you through how to secure your online shopping accounts, your banking account, gym accounts, any kind of account that you could possibly think of. We don't have them all within that tablet because it's being increasingly difficult to put them on, but it just gives people an idea of, if you are separating from a partner, even if it's non-abusive, there are things that you're probably digitally tied together that you need to be separating. And quite often what we do is we think about the bigger things, but we don't always think about the smaller things, such as online shopping accounts and Just Eat accounts. And if you don't want somebody to know where you've moved to, those things are associated with a location and payment details. So it's really important to make sure that you separate those.
If we are asked by a client about tech facilitated abuse, and they've got concerns which quite often arise from things like, something that comes up really common is linked kind of accounts on an iPad, and someone else's emails will pop up and you see things, and you know that's something that can lead into those conversations. What is it that family lawyers can do that can help clients in this position who are, going through this experiencing this abuse, and what are things that family lawyers shouldn't do? Are there things that you find that family lawyers do that can exacerbate a situation that we should not?
I think the key things that we kind of hear and we see are family lawyers. What we find is perpetrators will quite often gain access to a survivor's email account, but won't make any significant changes, such as blocking her out from that account. But what they will do is they'll forward on particular emails because they're keen to read information exchanged by a solicitor, because quite often it has child contact information, financial settlement agreements. So it's important that communication is confidential. So it's about having a conversation when you have a client in your care, saying, what does safe contact look like for you? Can we be assured that when we're sending over any documents, any information, it is safe, it's going to a safe email account? Maybe it's advisable to have a separate email account away from your emails that you currently have, so we can be assured that when we're sending information over, it is confidential, because you don't want to find yourself in a position that you turn up to court for a child custody settlement, and then the perpetrator has a bundle of evidence against the other party because they've been reading emails to and from a solicitor, so has a step ahead. Same with financial settlements. It gives them an opportunity to maybe hide money, make things increasingly difficult for the other party. So it's really important that safe contact, trying to encourage somebody to set up a separate email account away from their other email account is a priority. And then also what we hear as well a lot of times is a family court solicitor will turn around and say to a survivor, there's an agreement in place through court that you have to keep communicating with this person, even though quite clearly it's abusive, even though there's clear signs of stalking and harassment, and they'll still be telling them to make contact and to speak to them and engage with them because there's a contact agreement in place. And actually sometimes there needs to be other methods of communication that you can be looking at supporting that survivor to obtain, because it's just placing them at significant risk of harm.
Can you give some examples of the other forms of communication that might be useful in those circumstances?
Third parties or other methods of communication that may be safer. So if they don't feel comfortable speaking to them via Skype, for instance, video contact, phones, because they want to potentially record evidence of this person being abusive, then maybe documenting through a separate email account that they've got with that just through for that perpetrator, or separate messages as well that then they can relay back to court as evidence of this person is just using this method to abuse me, to harass me, and here's my evidence of that. Because what we had was there was a particular instance where a perpetrator was only insisting on speaking to the survivor late in the evening, around 10, half 10 every night. And when that went back to court and she said, he's doing this on purpose, so it's the last thing I think about at night, I then can't sleep, I'm very unsettled. The court says, well, he can speak to you whatever time he wants. If that's the only time he can speak to you, then that's perfectly reasonable. But it's about looking at the wider context of domestic abuse and coercive control. It's quite evident that that perpetrator could speak to her at any given time in the day, but was purposely picking those times. And it's about the context of the emails as well. So, and the contact with the survivor, because quite clearly there's evidence of quite abusive threats, coercive control, patterns of harassment, and it's about unpicking those and then advocating for the survivor to say there's quite clear evidence here that this person is just misusing this process to continue to abuse, and the interests are not in the best interests of the child. And I think sometimes, quite often, the children are completely overlooked. We should stop saying in child contact hearings that a child should have the responsibility to keep a phone on them 24/7, because if the father wants to speak to them at 3 o'clock in the morning, he has the right to. That's not reasonable, and we wouldn't say that in any other situation, but people find themselves entrapped in that because they're so scared of parental alienation.
What are your views on parenting apps being used a lot? I was just intrigued as to what your views were on how helpful they were, and whether they help or hinder with the sort of communication and tech abuse that we've been talking about.
They definitely hinder, and quite often what happens is the perpetrator's chosen a particular app, he's set it up. Family courts and magistrate courts, solicitors probably have not very much understanding of how the app particularly works and the features within it and the concerns associated with syncing devices and the access it may give him to her accounts and information. So quite often there's concerns there around mirroring accounts, syncing devices that just are not well thought through, because somebody just hasn't been able to educate themselves with how that app is working.
Parenting gap's something we use quite a bit, so I'm slightly concerned and interested to hear that, because when you're talking about setting up separate email addresses, that's something I advise clients on a lot. The moment there's a suggestion about kind of tech facilitated abuse is going to be my first port of call. But I've never had a hearing or a case where I've suggested, where it's been the case that a child has been given the phone and the responsibilities on the child. Just don't think that's appropriate, particularly when there's a background of abuse. It needs to be focused, and I completely understand what you're saying about the timing. The parenting apps, things like Our Family Wizard, some things that recommended, are something that I've found historically quite useful, because I've found that there's a couple of things. Is that one, as a solicitor, you can get your clients to log in if they choose to share it with you, so you can see the emails and see the tone, and then they can be presented to the court. And if there is stuff that looks like abuse, then you can kind of shut that down. But so I'm a bit concerned that if we're using those and they are something that's really unhelpful for victims, for survivors to go through, then what can be difficult is third parties can be really useful, but getting someone to commit as a third party is really, really hard and a big ask for people. And especially if you've got someone, if you've got a father who is being abusive, then throwing a third party into that situation where then they are faced with the abuse is a huge ask for people. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to kind of discuss that in a bit more detail about, sort of safe ways that we can do. Because the other thing that then comes up is, well, communication can go through solicitors, and an abusive ex will then take advantage of that by sending a gazillion emails to drive up costs. And obviously then, and that becomes another form of abuse. So it kind of really limits the mechanisms for keeping contact going, particularly where, given court proceedings, allegations of domestic abuse may be made, but the court can't instantly say, well, these are true or these are false. They have to be found. And you've often got months and months and months till you get to a fact-finding hearing to determine whether this abuse has taken place, during which time the court's going to say, well, there needs to be some form of contact. I just wonder some other tips that you might be able to share for us, that we can do that in a sort of safe way that's not going to exacerbate the sort of the experience of the victim.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, if somebody is at risk, then they need to look at obtaining particular orders as well, even if there is child contact case ongoing, because their safety is paramount. As is the safety of the children as well. I appreciate it's a really difficult juggling act, and we find that as well. Whenever there is child contact disputes ongoing, it's really, really difficult to try and find a balance of keeping that person safe and also adhering to the court orders as well, that states you have to contact, you have to send your child at particular dates and times, you have to communicate with the other party. So it's really, really difficult. If there are particular apps that you're finding that are working for your clients, and there's features within those apps that are quite helpful, such as Family Wizard, that's absolutely fine. It's just what has been presented to us has not been so helpful. There's been particular apps that have been advised that we've seen that have had the opposite effect. They've been less helpful. And I think what's fundamental is it's the response in court as well. So it's about when it's evident and it gets to court that this is quite clearly stalking and harassment, the response isn't to turn around to the survivor and say, you can't use any of this evidence to present to the police, which we hear quite often, because this is confidential space and it's confidential information, so you can't share it outside of the court. And that's not helpful as well, because she may need to present it to the police to provide evidence to say, this is what he's presenting in court every few months. All of this evidence that he's been monitoring me, checking where I've been going, evidence of my appointments, contact with me, downloading all my emails, etc., etc. So again, I think there's further conversations around supporting courts to have a better response, supporting them to identify coercive control and technology facilitated abuse, but also working in line with the police as well to put protective measures in place, because it can't just sit with you. It needs to be a multi-agency approach, not just set with solicitors, because like you say, it's going to be abused then, and then perpetrators are going to be like, great, well, I'll happily communicate with you at the cost of her financially, which we know will be something that they will enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. You do get those, particularly litigants in person not acting through solicitors, so they're not having their own costs, and they will bombard you. And I'm sure all family lawyers will take a view on that, and I will often say to clients, I'm not charging you for all this stuff. It is nonsense. That's just not fair. He's doing it deliberately, and find a way to shut that communication down and kind of not engage and not play their game. It is really the way you have to deal with it, I think, as a lawyer. And that feeds into some of the other things that we talk about in some of these podcasts about not just passing on communications direct, forward on the email saying, here's something that I've got, because that's triggering, and you need to be a filter, and rather than just you don't want to kind of just be a postman, do you, and pass things on. You've got to protect people from these things, because there are these specific triggers. I think your example of the late night communication is a really stark example of something that could appear kind of innocent, but is like really deeply kind of malevolent in its intent, isn't it? To really get inside someone's head at a kind of a vulnerable time late at night.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's the key thing with supporting courts to have better training around coercive control and the methods in which perpetrators are misusing. It's helpful for them to then identify patterns. So when it's presented in court, they can clearly understand this is a pattern of stalking and coercive control. And it's shocking how much that is missed. And we don't want to pick, and start unpicking with particular agencies where there is a poor response, but there is a lack of response around stalking, harassment, domestic abuse. And sometimes they'll say, well, it's historic, you're no longer in the relationship, so you're safe now. But it's not, it's just moved and it's in a different context. It's post-separation abuse, quite often through the child contact and through the court process.
And what do you think should be maybe a slightly wider question? We'll perhaps finish on something that individuals can do, some sort of practical steps that people can take if they're feeling that they're going through this, or friends or family members are. But maybe before that, just be interested in your sort of wider perspective, because it's such an enormous problem. You're dealing with, particularly, social media companies and these huge, publishers through whether app stores and you're dealing with cultural issues around consent and education. Clearly, it's a fast developing area given technology and the pace that it moves at. And it strikes me that it's something that, then there really needs to be an address on a sort of statutory level, some government action, police action. What do you think from a wider kind of macro perspective, what can be done to kind of limit the ability for people to facilitate this sort of abuse?
I think the first thing really is to work with tech developers as well, to explain to them how we have researched and found evidence that their products historically or still currently are being used to abuse other people. So talking them through how a particular device works and how a perpetrator is able to misuse that device, and then working with them. So before a product goes to market, to help them understand how that product could be misused, if they've got particular design features, particular flaws that they may be overlooked because they've not considered from the aspect of intimate partner relationship, because they'll have tech developers that consider from third party, as in like, how can we protect your device from hackers? But they won't always consider how an intimate partner can abuse that device, and then it can cause somebody to be stalked, harassed, located, and the concerns related to that. So I think fundamentally looking at prevention is key. So working with tech developers, the online safety bill, any legislative asks as well. So we did work around the Naked Threat campaign to make sure that it was illegal to threaten to share an intimate image. Again, to look at that prevention rather than the image being circulated online and then having to deal with the fallout. Campaign pieces as well. So going back to raising awareness of what technology facilitated abuse is. So not just with the general public, but with agencies, with police especially, rolling a national training programme out for police. So it helps them understand what the issues are and how they can respond safely to survivors. Because when I'm reading through domestic homicide reviews, there's a key theme is that lack of understanding around there's an idea that it's online, so that person isn't at risk, she's not high risk because all of the abuse is happening online, but how quickly that can turn to physical, and it often does. So it's about making those connections and those dots.
Thank you. That was so helpful. And I think there's loads of really interesting content there that people are going to find really useful moving forward. So I guess that's it for this episode of Stowe Talks. Thanks for listening. If you are at any immediate risk of domestic abuse, please call the police. You can also access help and support from the 24-hour National Domestic Abuse Helpline on 0808 2000 247. You can find out more about the work that Refuge does to support survivors of tech abuse at www.refugetechsafety.org. If you would like more information on our podcasts, head over to stowtalks.co.uk, and please rate, like and share and review this podcast where you can.